Segment 2, the American way of war. You mentioned a number of factors that make the American way of war distinctive. Let's consider a couple of the factors you put forward. All of these I'm quoting from the father of us all. Quote, Americans are united by shared ideas and commitments such as the ideals of equal opportunity and individual merit. Our military functions as a reflection of our national meritocracy. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, take it for example, we always say that drafts and mobilizations and conscript armies are the ideal, and they are in a sense because they get people from different backgrounds and put them all together. But North Korea has a draft, Iran has a draft, but they don't serve the same social need or civic need that ours does. In other words, we have a professional military of volunteers now who have more rights and responsibilities because they are Americans, and the military code of justice reflects, in a military sense, the Constitution than a North Korean or an Iranian conscript. So the ideas of America are transmogrified into our military. So each soldier understands that he is an individual and a citizen. Each Iranian, each North Korean is not a citizen. They may be a draftee, but they are a coerced subject with no rights, and no rights of legal protection under the law. And that makes a difference for a soldier who's fighting, because he understands that he's fighting for a system that empowers the individual, will empower his children, will empower his friends, and he's not subject to the capriciousness of a tyrant or a dictator or a thug, as in true of North Korea in the long run.
Right. You made the point earlier that victory goes not to those who make no mistakes. Yeah. Everybody makes mistakes in war, but to those who make the fewest. But you also argue elsewhere in the book, victory also goes to those who can adapt to the mistakes and adapt to the. And there's the individualism, the adaptability of the individual American soldier is important.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. I'll go back to that first example about the bocage.
Right.
So they go in there, and all of their grandees and all of the SHAEF organizers did not anticipate the bocage. And the Shermans were not up to the Panzer Mark III and the Panthers, and they were exposed when they went up over the hills. And what happens? The individual says, we can weld spikes on rhinos onto the tank, we can blast through the hedgerows, and then that filters through to the sergeants, to the majors, and then people argue about it. And then that bottom-up, top-down filtration of knowledge is absolutely impossible in an authoritarian dictatorial system that's reflected in martinets in the military. And our system has always allowed that osmosis of ideas. It happens throughout Western civilizations. It's there with the Greeks. Greek soldiers will say, or Spartans, we have a testimonial where a Spartan hoplite will say, wait a minute, we should not be drifting to the right, let's stop. And his commander will then make ad hoc decisions. So that reflects the society in which people participate.
Another aspect of the American way of war, I'm quoting again from the father of us all. The frontier experience on such a vast continent made Americans conquer time and space. Close quote. What has that got to do with our way of war?
Well, if you look at World War I or World War II, there was an impatience. World War I, within 11 months, we put 1 million soldiers into France and Belgium without losing one, and the whole purpose was to restrain Pershing because he wanted to get there, find the enemy, defeat them, and get home. In a very restless, consensual society who's used to going on to the next things. The problem with Iraq was, in part...
Was Pershing making a political calculation? That is to say, an American general even then said what generals say today, which is in America you have to win fast, the public won't stand for a long...
He wanted to go to Berlin, which would have been the right thing to do after the war. Patton is the...
Second World War.
Yeah, he's emblematic of the American experience. Get in tanks, forget the flanks, push, push, push. And so Americans in this vast continent of great distances were very attuned very early to machines, the transcontinental railroad, the telegraph. Young kids grew up fixing Model A's, fixing Model T's, shooting their own guns on the frontier. That restless can-do, the individual wants to move, 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 made the American military a very mobile, highly impatient, very adept at transportation, logistics, and it was not well suited for something like the Somme or Verdun or 6 or 7 years in Iraq or Vietnam.
Guns. Widespread gun ownership in the United States, I'm quoting you, has meant that a large segment of American youth does not grow up afraid of or inexperienced with firearms, close quote.
Yes, I think that helps a great deal. If you have a society in which firearms are either rare or they're outlawed or the gun owner is viewed under suspicion, it's very hard to take somebody at 18 or 19 and give him a gun and say, go do it. Well, I talked to a lot of people in the military. I don't think I've met very many American soldiers who had not shot some type of rifle or shotgun or pistol before they got into the military, and they feel very comfortable with it, and they talk about guns. And so it's a gun-owning society. It still is.
All right. Now, the emphasis on a broad democratic military, the elimination of the draft means we've now had several generations of Americans who've simply skipped military service. Military action of mass and materiel and impatience. Well, but in Afghanistan, we're relying on small units of special ops. A gun culture, does that still apply when we've got unmanned drones firing from 30,000 feet when somebody pushes a button in Kansas or Florida?
Well,
so, in other words, are we moving? Is what we know, what you describe as the American way of war, are we at an end? Are we
No, I don't think
finding
so.
our way into some new way of war?
The Romans had a phrase called mutatis mutandis. Everything's the same if you make the necessary corrections for time and space. So we don't have as many gun owners, obviously, in an urbanized society, but we have this weird video gun culture. So the people who are directing predators are people who are doing this with their hands, and they're used to it as somebody who's not, I guess, not hostile to the notion of playing a very violent video game. That element within our collective experience translates into a very adept console shooter, if I can use the term. And we look at Afghanistan. I know that we're doing counterinsurgency. We're trying to win hearts and minds. But if you look at the American material effort, the sheer pallets of food, the enormous expense in predators, we are trying to use technology, capital, expertise to win that war, as we usually do. We're not trying to win that war by saying, maybe we should. We're going to get 5,000 Afghan speakers. We're going to send them out, and over 20 years, by osmosis, they're going to make a kinder and gentler Afghanistan.
So you don't see...
We're restless, in other words.
I'm thinking back to 2003 or even 2002 when we're preparing to go into Iraq. And Shinseki, the Army Chief of Staff, said we need 200, 300, I can't remember the name, but he was clearly on the side. It sounded almost like World War II. We need hundreds of thousands. We need mass.
Yes.
And Donald Rumsfeld said no. We need a small, rapid force. You don't see that as Rumsfeld on a kind of innovative edge away from
No, he was, but they had one thing in common. What drove Donald Rumsfeld was on to the next objective. We went into Afghanistan, and now we're going to go into Iraq, and then we'll do whatever we have to after that. And what drove Shinseki was, yes, okay, but we're going to go in there and crush the enemy with American firepower. Neither one of them, if you had asked them, General Shinseki was not saying we need, maybe post facto people said he was, but he was not saying we need 300,000 so we can stay there for 10 years.
No, that's right.
And same thing with Donald Rumsfeld. And so they shared the same idea that one had a different view, a different tactic than the other, but the idea was they were going to use American technology, expertise, firepower to defeat the enemy in a very as brief a time. Shinseki just thought you could do it with manpower. Rumsfeld thought you could do it with technology. And by the way, talking about military error, look how a knowledge of military history would have taught us something. Hitler, people say, why did Hitler go into Russia? Hitler went to Russia because he looked back at World War I. The German army had knocked the Soviets out in 2.5 years, or the Tsar and then the communists, 2.5 years. But they never knocked the French out and the Allies, the British, for 4 years. So they go into 1940, 6 weeks, they knock out the French and the British. And Hitler's thinking, oh my God, the nightmare of World War I's over. There's a formula. 4 years to 2 in World War I will mean 6 weeks to 3 weeks in World War II, because the Eastern Front's always the easiest. That's why he thought he could get away with 3 weeks. He didn't have a winter. Think of us. We go into Afghanistan 7 weeks, and we have the Loya Jirga and a constitutional system up in 6 months. Americans are thinking, wow, we beat Saddam before. It's a literate society. It has ports. It's got visible airspace. It's got all the advantages. They take out Saddam in what? Half the time they took out.
3 weeks.
Exactly. And they're thinking, okay, 6 months led to a consensual society in Afghanistan, 3 months in Iraq. And they didn't plan sufficiently. And it shows you that a lot of people make these false analogies, and they don't take that each situation is different. Knowledge of military history might have said to them, be careful, Hitler made the same analogy about the relatively relative difficulty between the East and West fronts, and he learned the wrong lessons from World War I.